What if everything you were promised growing up turned out to be something completely different? What if the dream you believed in for years, the one you thought you were building, was never really yours to begin with? For nearly 2 decades, viewers of Little People, Big World watched the Roloff family create something that felt bigger than just a farm. It was a legacy, a future, a promise passed down from one generation to the next. We saw the hard work, the family moments, the vision of one day keeping it all in the family. But now, fans are starting to question everything, because the story of Roloff Farms may not be what it seemed. Behind the scenes, tensions were growing, expectations were forming, and conversations, some public, some private, were shaping a very different reality. There are now growing claims that what unfolded over the last 17 years wasn't just a series of misunderstandings, but a chain of decisions that changed everything. Relationships fractured, opportunities lost, and trust stretched to its limit. So how did things go from a shared family dream to one of the most talked about fallouts in reality TV? And the biggest question of all, was this outcome inevitable? Or was it carefully set in motion all along? Let's break it all down. To understand how everything unraveled, we have to go back to the beginning. Long before the headlines, before the disagreements, before the tension became impossible to ignore. There was a vision built on hard work, resilience, and the idea of creating something lasting, not just for one person, but for an entire family. What started as a simple property slowly transformed into something much bigger. Over the years, that land became more than just a home. It became a destination, a business, and eventually a symbol. Viewers watched it grow season after season, structures being built, ideas coming to life, and a family working together toward what seemed like a shared goal. And at the center of it all was the belief that one day, this wouldn't just be a success story. It would be a legacy passed down. That idea was repeated often, not always in direct promises, but in conversations, in expectations, in the way the future was talked about. There was a sense, both on screen and off, that the next generation would eventually step in, take over, carry it forward, keep the dream alive. And for years, that belief only grew stronger. As the children got older, their roles began to shift. They weren't just kids running around the farm anymore. They were contributing, learning the business, becoming part of the bigger picture. And from the outside looking in, it all seemed aligned. A family working toward the same future. A plan that felt almost unspoken, yet widely understood. But here, where things start to get complicated, because while the vision may have felt shared, the details were never entirely clear. What did taking over the farm actually mean? Was it symbolic? Was it realistic? Or was it something that was never fully defined in the first place? Over time, those unanswered questions didn't just fade away. They grew. Behind the scenes, perspectives began to shift. What one person saw as a long-term plan, another may have seen as an assumption. What felt like a promise to some may have been viewed very differently by others. And that's where the foundation starts to crack. Because when expectations aren't clearly defined, they don't just disappear. They build quietly. They evolve. And eventually, they collide. As the years went on, the farm itself became more valuable, not just emotionally, but financially. It wasn't just a family space anymore. It was a business with real stakes, real numbers, real decisions that couldn't be avoided forever. And with that shift came pressure. Decisions about ownership, about responsibility, about what the future would actually look like, not in theory, but in reality. And suddenly, the dream that once felt simple became complicated. Because now, it wasn't just about family. It was about control, about timing, about who gets what and how, and perhaps most importantly, about whether everyone was ever truly on the same page to begin with. Looking back, some fans believe the signs were always there. Small moments, subtle disagreements, differences in tone during conversations that, at the time, didn't seem like a big deal. But in hindsight, they may have meant more than anyone realized. Because what looked like a unified vision on the surface may have been built on very different expectations underneath. And when those expectations finally met reality, everything changed. The question is, was this a breakdown that happened suddenly? Or was it something that had been building, quietly, for years? Because if there's one thing this story makes clear, it's that what we see on the surface is rarely the full picture. And sometimes, the biggest turning points don't come from one dramatic moment, but from years of assumptions, finally catching up all at once. That belief didn't just exist within the family, it extended outward to the audience as well. For years, viewers weren't just watching a reality show. They were watching what felt like a long-term legacy unfold in real time. The idea that the farm would one day be handed down wasn't treated like a possibility. It felt like an inevitable next chapter. And that's where things get complicated. Because expectations, especially unspoken ones, have a way of growing stronger over time. What may have started as a hopeful assumption slowly turned into something much more solid in the minds of everyone involved. The longer the farm remained at the center of family life, the more it felt like its future had already been decided. But behind the scenes, reality was likely far more complex. Running a property like that isn't just about memories and tradition. It's about finances, responsibility, long-term planning, and difficult decisions that don't always align with emotional expectations. And while viewers saw heartfelt moments, celebrations, and family milestones on screen, they weren't seeing the full picture. They weren't seeing the private conversations, the disagreements, the shifting priorities. Because as the children grew older, their lives began to move in different directions. Their goals changed, their perspectives evolved, and what once may have felt like a shared vision may not have stayed that way forever. At the same time, the person at the center of it all, the one responsible for maintaining everything, was facing a completely different reality. Owning and operating something like that comes with pressure, not just to preserve what's been built, but to make decisions that ensure its survival. And sometimes, those decisions don't match what others were hoping for. That's where the tension begins. Because when one side sees legacy, and the other sees responsibility, it creates a gap that's hard to bridge. And that gap doesn't form overnight. It builds slowly, over years of assumptions, missed conversations, and expectations that were never fully clarified. So by the time the topic of the farm's future became real, truly real, it wasn't just a discussion about property. It was about everything that property represented. Childhood, trust, identity, and perhaps most importantly, promises, whether they were ever officially made or not. And when something that meaningful suddenly feels uncertain, it doesn't just create disappointment. It creates conflict. The kind of conflict that isn't always visible at first, but once it surfaces, it changes everything. At first, those disagreements weren't fully visible to the outside world. From a viewer's perspective, everything still seemed relatively normal. The farm was operating, the family was showing up for events, and the public image remained intact. But behind the scenes, the tone had clearly changed. What used to feel like informal conversations between family members had turned into structured discussions. Numbers were being brought in, evaluations were happening, and emotions, once tied to memories and legacy, were now colliding with financial reality. Because here's the part that made everything more complicated. The farm wasn't just a sentimental piece of land anymore. It had become a high-value asset. Years of television exposure, tourism, seasonal events, and branding had transformed it into something much bigger than what it started as. And with that transformation came a new layer of pressure, one that doesn't always align with family expectations. So when talks of ownership became serious, so did the stakes. From one side, there was the belief that this was a continuation of a legacy, a passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. From the other side, there was a business mindset, one that viewed the farm in terms of market value, long-term sustainability, and financial fairness. And those two perspectives, they didn't match. Not even close. Because what one person saw as an opportunity to carry on something meaningful, the other may have seen as a major financial decision that had to make sense on paper. And that disconnect is where everything began to fracture. Reports and conversations suggested that when an offer was finally put on the table, it didn't align with expectations. Not in price, not in structure, and not in vision. For the son who had grown up believing this would one day be his responsibility, it felt like the goalposts had moved. Like the promise had changed. Or maybe, from another perspective, it had never been a promise at all, just an assumption that grew stronger over time. And that distinction, it matters more than anything. Because in situations like this, the difference between a spoken commitment and an implied expectation can define everything that follows. What makes it even more emotional is the timing. This wasn't happening when everyone was young and figuring things out. This was happening after years, decades of building that belief. After a lifetime of memories tied to that land. After viewers themselves had bought into the idea that this was the natural next step. So when things didn't go that way, it didn't just feel like a disagreement. It felt like a breaking point. And from there, the situation only grew more public. Subtle comments in interviews, tension during on-screen conversations, moments where what wasn't being said spoke louder than anything that was. Because by this stage, it was clear. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about trust, about communication, about whether everyone had truly been on the same page, or if they had been living in completely different versions of the same story. And once that realization sets in, it's almost impossible to go back. Because now, every past conversation gets re-examined. Every expectation gets questioned. And every decision moving forward carries the weight of everything that came before it. Which leads to the next phase of the story. The fallout. Because when something like this reaches the surface, when private disagreements become public knowledge, it doesn't just affect business decisions. It changes relationships. It reshapes family dynamics. And in some cases, it creates distance that's hard to repair. So the question now isn't just what happened. It's what happens next. At the end of the day, what we're witnessing isn't just a disagreement over property. It's a much deeper story about expectations, communication, and what can happen when family and business become impossible to separate. Whether this all came from a misunderstanding that slowly grew over time, or from deeper tensions that had been building beneath the surface for years, really depends on who you ask. But one thing is undeniable: the impact. A shared dream that once brought everyone together now stands at the center of division. And for fans watching from the outside, it leaves one lingering question. Was this always inevitable? Or could things have turned out differently if just a few moments had gone another way? Sometimes it only takes one decision, one conversation to change everything. With that said, thank you for watching, and until next time.